From the beginning of, I would say, October, you've likely been made aware of the growing number of content creators and players voicing concerns of the supposed HP inflation phenomenon happening in Honkai Star Rail, which has been present ever since the game started, but has been growing at a rate more and more conspicuous in recent cycles. Version 2 oversaw a ton of advancements in the meta, from team engines being fully expanded on to a brand new game mode, to entirely new mechanics like Super Break or ultimates that don't function off energy being added, among other details. But version 3 has teased us with quite possibly the most ambitious change being implemented yet, a brand new path. Not only that, but supposedly they're also flirting with other expansions to combat that will radically change the metagame as we know it. Amidst all of this, there's one simple yet insidious problem that's been growing in relevance. Honkai Star Rail is getting progressively harder. It's inevitable for a game to increase in challenge and strength. If the game's difficulty stayed the same, there would be no incentive for players to go out of their way to find more efficient or inventive means to complete it. While empirically, Star Rail is a bit more demanding on character versatility than what we were used to in Genshin, it's done a phenomenal job at ensuring gainful employment for a sizable chunk of the roster. But in light of the HP inflation people have been discussing and criticizing, are we about to experience a difficulty spike in version 3 that makes the game no longer casual friendly, or is this all an overreaction to a problem that sounds scarier than it actually is? For today, we'll be going over Star Rail's hidden difficulty curve that's no longer all that hidden anymore. It's no secret that Star Rail's version 2 units on average are measurably stronger and more capable than its version 1 roster. Looking at the Apex tiers at the moment, for MOC, the only characters not from version 2 are Dr. Ratio, Topaz, Runmei, Huohua, and Fuxuan. A similar proportion holds true for Pure Fiction and Epoch Shadow. Version 2's characters, along with their signature weapons, are definitely operating on a level higher than their predecessors, not just dealing more damage but accounting for more scenarios, offering a wider range of buffs and for longer, and overall having larger power budgets. Even though version 1 units are not doing too bad, the gap between version 2 and version 1 is very much visible to even casual players. What about the other side of the equation, the content? If Star Rail made such an effort to ensure every character released in version 2 was decent at worst, there has to be a reason for that. If characters are being released with more damage, stronger buffs, higher defensive capability, for us to feel pressure to pull for them, they would have to force our hand. That's where the whole HP inflation discussion comes into play. Ever since the first MOC that featured floor 12, the total HP pool of a cycle has been steadily increasing. Given your score is determined by how fast you defeat all enemies, more HP inherently means the more effort required to complete it. From the first MOC 12 cycle beginning in early 2024, the total HP pool was around the ballpark of 3.6 million, with the swarm having 580k times 2 or close to 1.2 million health. 3 cycles later, that number jumped to around 4.3, Sam being the big boss and having 1.6 million HP in reserve. Considering that's a quarter of a year though, a 20% or so increase over 3 cycles isn't too bad. However, in the very next one, the HP pool jumped to 5.6 million, a 30% increase right off the bat. That's a significant spike in such a short amount of time. That was also when players first begin to notice the game's content start to get challenging, since prior to that, 0 to 1 cycle clears have been fairly easy to pull off. The total health pool would continue to go up to around 6.2 million, with Aventurine, the big boss of that cycle, taking up 1.1 million times 2, or just under 2.2 million. Thankfully, the health pool has been distributed across more enemies, making the overall difficulty higher for single target-oriented units, but easier for AoE-focused characters, who become more effective against groups of 4 or 5 enemies. Fortunately, we have been getting an influx of incredibly strong units during that time like Fei Xiao, Yunli, Cao Cao, Robin, and such. Any player who's been maintaining their account throughout that time shouldn't have been too affected by the rise in DPS requirement. It wasn't until our previous MOC cycle, which came out in version 2.6, that things began to really start escalating. From the Big Sleep to Scale Gorge Tidal Flow, the total HP count went from 6.2 mil to 9.2. Hule took up 1.4 million times 2 or just shy of 2.9 million to be specific, a staggering increase of just under 1.5 times altogether. To be fair, much of that has to do with the fact that one side has 8 enemies, in particular the second wave featuring that trio boss who all share one health pool, the name's escaping me at the moment. That means for AoE characters, the HP pool went from 4.4 mil to only 5.3. Not the most unbearable, but it was still a sharp increase, especially for single target and blast attackers who've been feeling the sting pretty hard. On a side note, I love how back in version 1 prior to Pure Fiction it felt like the erudition path was completely irrelevant. Now we're going in the opposite direction where erudition is king and the destruction trio is in shambles. Currently, we're now in Dancing with the Dreams, featuring yet another increase in total HP from 9.2 million to 10.7. Once again, most of that is because the second room is completely erudition based, with that TV Voltron looking ass dude sharing a health pool across 5 enemies, and the wave before that also consisting of 5 dudes. In totality, to answer the question, is HP inflation happening? Yes, but contextually it's not as bad as it looks. For single target specific units like Seela, absolutely she's getting hammered by the tankier enemies as they're simply too resilient for her to be able to one-shot them to then proc resurgence. For AoE characters though, it's been fairly minuscule. Also again, our roster has power crept a fair amount too. Facial may be single target, but that bitch attacks like 20,000 times per turn cycle. Meanwhile, Boothill straight up nukes your entire soul with a single hit. Damage values are just a lot higher now. 500,000 used to be an achievement, now it feels like the norm one with how stronger buffers and units have become. In Pure Fiction, things have also gotten a bit more challenging. Fortunately not as much as MLC, but still enough for it to be noticeable. The first couple iterations hung around the 6 to 7 million mark, and throughout spring and summer we've been sitting between 8 to 9 million. Following 2.6 though, Rumor Mill, the cycle we're on right now, shot up all the way to 13.5 million. Granted, they made a fundamental change to Pure Fiction where essentially damage dealt to side enemies also damages a boss. For example, Yanqing has a total HP pool of 2.2 million, which is a massive step up from Bronya and Kokoli's average of 1.3 in the previous cycle, but attacking the mooks will now drain HP from the Han Honcho. So basically erudition characters don't get screwed over by the boss being alive even after you finish off the ads, as their HP also cuts into the boss's health. Regardless, the point still remains, more and more HP is being added to these enemies, consequently making them more arduous to clear. For obvious reasons, I can't go any further than the current cycles, but if you watch other videos discussing HP inflation, you'll get a glimpse of the scale of increase in future cycles. And putting it bluntly, this is only the start. I have a feeling version 3 is really gonna push the limits on what our characters can handle. To reiterate one more time, difficulty is relative. It doesn't matter if a cycle has a pool of 10 million health or 10 billion. What matters is whether we have the tools to clear it or not. Having stated before that version 2 units are significantly stronger than version 1, players having access to more resources and avenues of combat than ever before, better weaponry, the aforementioned new mechanics that inflate our own DPS like Super Break, and of course the Cycle Turbulence buffs dealing way more damage than they used to. At a surface level, the relative difficulty of the game hasn't yet reached a point where there's a clear disparity between the game's content and our capacity to clear it. Keyword, yet. It's unclear as to what kind of leap in power and capability we'll bear witness to in version 3, so for all we know, even if future MLCs and Pure Fictions break into the 20 million mark in a few months, our teams will start doing millions of damage on a regular basis. Or perhaps the follow-up engine will advance even further to where characters pull off 20 attacks per turn. Maybe we'll start getting Harmony units to deal as much damage as carries. Who's to say? Then what are the potential issues that can arise from HP inflation of this caliber? First issue is that try as they might, older units can and will begin to feel the pressure of it. Power creep is acceptable and may even be necessary to sustain long-term interest in a game. If players have nothing to work towards, they'll eventually get bored and lose any reason to keep playing. The easiest way to consistently give us something to work towards is by requiring us to do more than what we were doing before. But in a game where balance changes don't exist, that being a unit's capability remains completely static, eventually that ceiling will extend beyond what that character was projected to be able to handle. That's not to say there are no ways to retroactively buff a character. Just take a look at Jingyuan. He's been getting spoon-fed buffs over and over to get him back up. By extension, that applies to the majority of the roster. As they say, a rising tide lifts all boats. But again, that's why the rate of acceleration matters. If the game's difficulty escalates too quickly, gradually buffing a character through indirect means will not be sufficient enough purely because of opportunity cost. We all know the advent of Sunday was a very appreciated buff for Jingyuan, alleviating many consistency problems he was dealing with and getting his DPS to a point where it's on par with the game's Apex characters. However, there could and likely will be other summon-oriented units who can make use of Sunday even better. In the long run, yes, a rising tide lifts all boats. No one can deny that 2.7 Jingyuan is a completely different beast than 1.0 Jingyuan, but he was still conceptualized as a version 1 character. There will come a time where no amount of outside help will be able to make up for what he intrinsically lacks. In other gacha games, where people don't have as big of an attachment towards units and see them mostly as tools to complete the game's content, discarding an old character is not that big of a deal, but in games like these, people very much care about their favorite character, socially questionable as it may be. That's why they need to be cautious not to push the game's difficulty too fast. I've personally witnessed other gacha games where S-tier characters would fall to C-tier or even become straight up unviable not even a few months later. I don't think Hoyo will ever go that crazy, but it's still something to consider, namely on account of there being 3 game modes. Done gradually and sensitively, people can come to terms with the fact that some units will just be left behind and make peace with it, especially if there are corresponding units who can take their place. But if done in a cavalier way, the whiplash can disenfranchise a lot of players, notably free-to-plays. With 3 separate endgame modes, players are expected to have a lot of different characters built up if they want to comfortably clear the game's content. As a gacha game, if you're not a whale, you can only pull for meta-relevant characters so quickly. Hoyo, like most other gacha companies, have a penchant for tailoring that version's endgame content to exactly what the new shiny 5-star specializes in. Understandably so, they want to sell the character, but there should always be a fair opportunity for players who don't have that character to still clear that game's content, even if it means it will take a bit of planning. Therein lies the concern. If HP inflates too quickly, off-meta strategies will become even more difficult to implement, turning that new character from a luxury that clears the cycle just like that into a necessity. and they're skirting a very fine line at the moment. Again, thankfully we're not anywhere near that point yet. I'm not saying come version 3, Akron, Firefly, and Facial are gonna be washed, but HP inflation is a surefire way to get to that point if it's not monitored correctly. It's also the lamest way to increase difficulty. HP scaling really comes down to just numbers, adding little if any meaningful layers of strategy. Much as I love Dragon Ball, rest in peace Toriyama, if I'm looking for more stimulating fight scenes I would go somewhere else, because every Dragon Ball fight usually boils down to who has more attack points. The beauty of turn-based games is strategy, as opposed to action games which place more emphasis on mechanical execution and presence of mind. While I do enjoy Star Rail's gameplay, one thing I wish they could expand on more is the strategic aspect of the game, because at the moment, Star Rail's endgame is mostly about how fast you can kill stuff. Not saying there's no element of strategy, optimizing rotations and picking the best teammates for the cycle plays a huge role in Star Rail's endgame, and by no means am I implying you could just put together a random team and perfect clear MOC, PF, and APOC, but a large chunk of the endgame ultimately comes down to just doing a lot of damage very quickly. HP inflation is not helping in this department. It only makes you have to gear up your units more efficiently, vertical invest even harder, and of course get better units. It's just a really boring way to make the game more difficult. There's a difference between difficult and challenging. Honkai Star Rail is more of the former. Yes, I've seen what they've been tinkering with in regards to version 3's potential new combat mechanics, but it still doesn't change the fact that we need more damage. And depending on the mechanics or cycle blessings or whatnot, we may run into situations where there are only a handful of teams, of which those teams likely require many of the new OP characters to be able to clear all of the game's content. There's no strategy involved other than you don't do enough DPS. That's the biggest underlying issue with Star Rail's endgame right now. Even though we have 3 different endgame modes that require different types of characters and win conditions, it ultimately simplifies into a DPS check. At the end of the day, power creep and by extension HP inflation only become problems if the game accelerates at such a fast pace that it stifles alternative options. The endgame has gotten more difficult to clear, zero cycles are getting less and less doable for non-spending players, and the requirements for character coverage have gone up. But I think in the foreseeable future we should be fine as long as Hoyo keeps the content's power scaling in line with our ability to handle it. On a more optimistic note, remember how earlier I said characters eventually fall off due to only accounting for the time period they were conceptualized? They already sort of covered that eventuality through all versions of characters, most relevant being Madame Herda. I'm not gonna call her the Herda, I can't take her seriously if I do. We're also about to get Teen Yun's 5-star version Fugue, March 7th got her March 8th version, and much earlier we had Dan Heng's Imbibitor Lunai version. All of these alternative releases are substantial upgrades to their base versions, or at least more modernized versions of them, and judging by how consistently Hoyo's been pumping them out, we can expect them to keep doing so later on. I wouldn't be surprised if we had an alt for Jingliu who's all healed and not psycho anymore. I know Brax will love that, or maybe an ascended Jingyuan. It's not entirely out of the question. Wrapping things up, HP inflation is very much real. Is it a problem? Not as big as people are making it out to be. That being said, it's on track to become a big problem if Hoyo doesn't manage it properly. The next few cycles will determine if Hoyo's gonna Thanos snap half the roster out of viability. I hope they don't, while I think a small amount of power creep is necessary to keep the game alive. Like I said in my character oversaturation video, I think Hoyo should be mindful of their speed. They're releasing a ton of characters and are pushing the difficulty ceiling of the game ever so slightly faster than what most players are comfortable with. They shouldn't be like Genshin where the game doesn't feel like it's getting any harder, but they also shouldn't pull a fake Grand Order and make us have to pay hundreds of dollars a month just to clear the game's content. But what are your guys' thoughts about this? Do you believe people are overreacting about HP scaling, or do you think it's as bad as they're making it out to be? I want to hear what you think in the comments. That's it for today, so if you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate it if you love to like and subscribe. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Vars, join my Discord server, and check out my other HSR discussion videos if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.